Hey, what's up? Another story from the Outer Reach, also known as Outlands. I'm going to keep this one a shorter one because if you watch the other in this line of videos, stories from Outlands, you already know what's coming, and I've already rehashed this several times now. But today we're talking about two vessels that basically destroyed a 20 to 30 person faction. I am, of course, speaking of the tiniest SNEK, Megalodon fast attack battleship, and the Pioneer's FOLLY, the Borodino class fast attack battleship. Both of these exist in my RP, PvP, D&D turn-based style server, which sounds a lot like a scam, but go ahead and watch the pinned video on my channel. You can kind of view it like a tabletop game, but instead of rolling for checks and imagining the set, we actually play it out and build the sets within a Space Engineers game. That's the footage you're watching behind the scenes. These ships were created by the infamous Khan's Enclave, a heavy capital ship focused faction that on paper was severely outnumbered. However, single-handedly, it fought against two other factions where it not only succeeded, but found itself destroying one of the factions and on the doorstep of another. If we rewind a bit, about 1 month before they found themselves on the precipice of destroying the first faction, it was fairly obvious that they were winning, and they were winning hard, and that they should begin preparations for this siege. Battle after battle were either draws, victories, with no meaningful losses to speak of. So while early production did go into creating a reserve, then utility vessels, then backups for your backups, the Khans found themselves with production excess that they simply didn't need to use to replace ships that they weren't even losing in the first place. Combined with the knowledge that if things would continue to go well, they would be bearing down upon the enemy's HQ and a long protracted battle might occur. Because of the overall size of this faction, this wasn't really doable. So instead, they suppressed the original Rider faction with 1 to 2 squadrons, which they were already doing quite effectively, and began building a force to destroy the CDF. The Khans were not arrogant. Well, okay, they were pretty fucking arrogant, but they were not stupid. So they knew that in order to have a quick and decisive victory, the heavy cruisers that they had were not cutting it. While cruisers they've previously used did have the prerequisite firepower, they didn't have the legs to last in a fight like this without having to go home for repairs, and they wanted to do this in a single punch. So they decided to build a battleship. Not just one battleship, but two. These capital ships had about 40 capital grade barrels. For the record, most cruisers only have about 10 to 15. So getting back to the Siege of Malta, with that foresight, the Khans showed up with 2 battleships and very impressive OPSEC with almost no one figuring out that these things existed. We have both the Megalodon and the Borodino. Technically, both of these are actually the class names. So Pioneer's FOLLY is the Borodino, and the tiniest SNEK is the Megalodon. However, the Khans have this really fun, amazing tendency to manage where they make a million classes, and each class is only a one-of class, so we typically just refer to the ship as their class name, generally because the actual name is a giant meme. Yes, it's very fun to manage them as a GM. Anyways, the Megalodon, tiniest SNEK, was a traditionally designed battleship, heavy emphasis on long-range bombardment and medium-range damage. The Megalodon could absolutely tango in CQB with other faster, smaller ships, but generally that would be left to its escorts, and its primary goal was taking out other capital grade ships or emplacements. The Borodino was a very unique vessel, something that we hadn't really seen in Outlands thus far, experimental in a way. It was designed with very insane thrust-to-weight ratios while sporting a respectable number of heavy capital grade weapons. However, instead of arranged in a broadside firing formation, they were actually arranged in a circular firing arc. So the ship could still engage with all of its capital grade weapons in a nose-hot profile. However, in all other profiles, only a fraction of the guns would be available. Combined with the reduced heavy weapon loadout and more medium weapons, the Borodino was designed as a chaser, offense, brawling battleship, whatever you want to call it, since it could functionally maneuver on target and keep weapons on target while executing on maneuvers that, say, a battleship could execute on, but it would risk having its guns fall out of the firing arc. The goal was not to have the biggest broadside, but it was simply to close with an enemy and constantly keep up a high rate of fire. Regardless, the day of the Siege of Malta came and went exactly as one would expect. The Khans did their prep work, their homework, and more, and they were rewarded with the death of a long-standing veteran faction that had existed up to a year, almost a year at this point. It was a slaughter. Both battleships racked up the kills, burning through 5 cruisers collectively in under 10 minutes, many of which lasted near seconds. For the record, up to this point, only 2 cruisers had been lost in Outlands thus far over the last year. The battleships simply proved damn effective in their role, as you can see on screen. Dead CDF ships everywhere. In fact, the battle was so successful that the attack force was actually mostly unharmed, such that the siege requirements of the battleships weren't even needed. The formation was wiped out in such quick succession that the siege part of Siege of Malta should have probably been replaced with the slaughter of Malta. From here, the Khans needed to shift gears. At this point, the Riders were actually beginning to get their shit together, and the super battleship EFN Eternity's Advent was conducting a deep strike into their territory. Thus far, they had to yield territory to the super battleship because they had nothing that could match it, and even trading it wasn't even on the table due to their forward deployed forces at Malta. However, now that the battleships were freed up and all of their forces were freed up, and a front was removed, they decided to send a task force to deal with the Eternity's Advent, with escort of course. The second battleship was decided to be used to hold the choke point and hold the Riders back until the EFN Eternity's Advent was dealt with, at which point they would resume the offensive against the Riders. The quick question was, which battleship do we send? Well, the clear answer was the Megalodon, the traditional weapon loadout battleship. It would be a perfect match for the Eternity's broadside, and it was also actually smaller, more maneuverable, and had similar firepower. This made the Eternity's Advent actually, on paper, weaker, as she was an easier to hit target that moved slower. And this proved to be true. The Megalodon had a much higher hit rate against the Eternity. However, the Megalodon and her squadron would still need to yield territory as they were unable to overpower the Eternity's tank and her squadron. However, they were eventually able to do so due to circumstance, isolate the Eternity alone, overpower her, and nearly destroy her. However, this took time, and on the flip side of the system, the Borodino's opening deployments after Malta were quite boring initially. However, then in rapid succession, the defensive line of the Khans broke in uncharacteristic fashion, and when the Borodino was called upon to hold, she kind of struggled to deal with the situation. Her first battle, and her basically final main battle, was against 4 deep strike destroyers. Weirdly enough, the Borodino struggled to close the distance with these destroyers and then destroy them outright early on in this battle. And while eventually she would get into ship kill range and wipe out a destroyer in under a second, which was a very funny thing to listen to on comms, by the way. You just hear a guy screaming and his ship immediately dies. But the battle was basically lost at this point, and the Borodino would eventually decide to fall back with her escorts due to the damage sustained. Several weeks later, we would find her alongside her sister battleship in their final stand, with the Khan's military who had utterly collapsed over the last couple weeks due to the overextension, relentless onslaught of the Riders, and the criticality of them simply just running out of ships and territory to give. The Borodino, ironically, once again struggled to convert on kills on smaller ships, which is her main purpose, and eventually she would be taken out by the Eternity's Advent, ending her and the war. The Megalodon, the tiniest SNEK, would eventually go on to survive the war and continue service in the Khan Navy, which would be renamed the Khan United Navy. If you want to go check out the series and see these things play out over time over the course of almost 6 months, go ahead and watch Season 1, maybe Season 2 of Outlands on the channel. And if you want to play with them, the battleships that is, go ahead, link down below, and both of them are available on the workshop. Regardless, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.